from Night Owl Crafts Australia. Today we're going to be looking at knitting and in particular casting on. Tosh, our able assistant, is going to be hovering in the background. Knitting is a very useful craft to learn. You can use it to make all sorts of items of clothing, from hats to scarves, jumpers, cardigans, vests, socks even. So today we'll be looking at the first stages of knitting, that is casting on, and we'll be looking at 3 different ways that you can cast on and the advantages and disadvantages of each. To start with though, you need to know a little bit about needles and the sizing of them, and wools and the different plies of wool. With needles, there are imperial and metric measurements. A little gauge like this can help you to compare the imperial versus metric gauges, and if your needles don't have an obvious size on them, you can use the holes to judge what size those needles are. To determine that, you put the needles through the holes and choose the smallest size that the needle will go through. In this case, it is a size 6 imperial and a size 5 metric. The sizing in metric means that the larger the number, the bigger the needle. Whereas in imperial it goes the opposite way, which is a bit confusing. So with imperial, the smaller the number, the bigger the needle. Tosh is digging her way to the Antarctic at the moment as we speak. With wools, you need to know a little bit about the plies. The bigger the number with plies, the thicker the wool. So the average size would be about an 8-ply wool. If you're making thicker jumpers, you might be going up to a 12-ply. If you're doing fine baby wear, you might be going down to a 4-ply or even less. When you're knitting, it's good to have on hand a crochet hook. These are ideal to help if you happen to drop a stitch, in order to hook it up and repair the drop stitch. We'll be having a look at that at a later time. You can also find needles called circular needles, and these are quite good for either knitting flat sections of knitting or knitting in the round, such as pairs of socks. You can also knit in the round using 4 individual needles, which are double-ended, but the circular needles are probably the easiest to manipulate. This sample is an example of the first type of casting on. This is the cast on edge here. The advantage of this form of casting on is that it is quick and simple. However, it is difficult to obtain even stitches. This stitch here is slightly larger than the others, and they all vary just a little bit. However, it's a good form of casting on for the very beginner knitter. To do this type of casting on, you need to get your wool, and with any of the cast on stitches, the first step is to make a slip knot. To make a slip knot, get your piece of wool, put it in a circle, cross over the beginning piece, and then around and push it through that loop, pulling it up, then tighten the 2 ends to form your slip knot. You'll then put the needle through the slip knot, tightening it, and for this form of casting on, you just put it across your finger, wrap your finger around and slip the stitch on. Again, slip it on, around your finger, slip it on. This is quite a fast way of getting the number of stitches that you want. You'll see now that as we start to knit, having cast on with this method, it will start to look a little bit untidy, a bit loopy. To knit from having the cast on stitches, you put the needle through the front part of each stitch. So pushing it through that front part of the knitted stitch, wrap the wool around the back needle and then pull it through and push that stitch off. We've now got Mac the cat coming to investigate what we're doing. As you know, cats love wool. We're continuing to knit, pushing the needle through the front part of the stitch, hello Mac, wrapping the wool around the needle and slipping it through, pushing the stitch off the needle on the left hand side. Trying to avoid knitting the cat's tail in there. We continue to knit all the cast on stitches up. You'll notice that the wool between the stitches tends to vary in length and it doesn't provide as neat an edge to it. However, for beginners, this is a stitch that is easy to master and can certainly be used as a cast on stitch. This form of casting on illustrates the second form of casting on, long tail casting on method that we'll be showing you. The advantage of this one is that it gives a much neater casting on row, and it's relatively simple to do. Say on it this jumper, you will end up with a much neater edge to the knitting. For this form of casting on, you need to get a long section of wool before you make your slip knot. You then make the slip knot by making your circle, pushing it through the wool through the circle and tightening it, putting it onto the needle and tightening the slip knot onto the needle. It's similar to the first form of casting on in that you make a loop with your finger, but instead of just putting that onto the needle, what we're going to do is put it on, but then with the wool on the ball side, we're going to actually do a knit stitch. So we make the loop, put the needle partly through it, put the wool around the needle and bring it through, casting off the part that's on your finger. So it's a form of hybrid cast on, using part of the first type of cast on and the third type that we'll be coming to shortly. You can continue until you've got enough stitches on your needle. Another way to do the long lead, or another positioning of your fingers to do the long lead cast on, is to hold both ends in your hand and put your thumb and forefinger through like so, creating almost a heart shape. You then pick up the wool that's on your thumb, go across, pick up the wool that was on your forefinger and make your stitch that way. So again, pick up the wool, go under the wool on your thumb, pick up the wool that was on your forefinger and make your stitch that way. So just going back to the original way that I showed you, putting it around your finger, taking a knit stitch. So both of these are creating stitches, cast on stitches, using the long tail of the wool. The disadvantage with this form is that it's often a bit hard to judge how much of a long tail you need to leave based on the number of stitches that you're going to be using. Sometimes I just guesstimate, sometimes I run a bit short, and sometimes I'll have a bit of waste wool left over. In the case of having waste wool left over, it's usually not a lot. I'll just trim it off when I've reached the number of stitches that I need.
Yes, good girl.
This is the third form of casting on that we'll show you, and it's the one that my grandmother taught me many, many years ago. It also gives a very even cast on edge, and the advantage of this one is that you don't waste any of the wool at the cast on stage. Like all the other forms of casting on, we have to form a slip knot. So the wool goes around through the loop and pull through and tighten. The needle then goes through this loop, and for this casting on method we need 2 needles. For the first stitch we put the needle through the loop on the needle, around, and pull it through. We then put this stitch onto the left hand needle. We now have 2 stitches on the left hand needle. From here on in, we put the needle through both parts of that front stitch. As you can see, there is a front part of the loop and a rear part. So we'll put the needle through both. That's how it will look. Wrapping the wool around the needle, we then pull it through and put it onto the left hand needle, making 3 stitches. Again, going through both parts of that loop, wool around and pull it through. It then goes onto the left hand needle. We continue in this fashion until we have as many stitches as we need for the piece of work that we are working on. So through both loops, around the needle, through, and hitch it onto the left hand needle. You'll find that you speed up as you get practiced in doing this form of knitting or casting on. And as I've mentioned before, it gives you a nice even form of casting on. You also don't have the problem of having to estimate how much of a tail you need, so you don't end up ever wasting wool on this end. Then when you've reached the number of stitches you want on your needles, you will then start to knit the first row. I hope you found this useful, looking at the 3 methods of casting on. You will find that practice makes perfect, and it will take you a little bit of time to get an even stitch pattern. I hope you found it more interesting than Tosh, who's put herself to bed in the background. Our next video should be of more interest for Tosh.